A young woman of barely 19 years old walked toward a destiny that seemed glorious, but which in reality hid the seed of her own destruction. Marfa Sobakina, daughter of a prosperous merchant from Novgorod, was chosen from among thousands of candidates to become the Tsarina of Russia. Her youth, her radiant beauty, and the hope of bringing healthy heirs to the throne presented her as the promise of a new era for the empire. However, what should have been the beginning of a life crowned by power and luxury transformed into a journey of barely 15 days toward death. At the center of this tragedy was a detail that no one suspected. Her own mother, in a desperate attempt to ensure her daughter's fertility, had administered a potion considered miraculous at the time. It was a mixture passed down through popular traditions, which promised robustness and the ability to conceive strong offspring. What that mother did not know was that the secret ingredient of that recipe, mercury, would be the most silent and devastating poison. Thus, what was born as a gesture of love ended up transforming into the Tsarina's death sentence. The setting in which this story unfolds was no less dramatic. Russia lived under the shadow of Ivan IV, known to history as Ivan the Terrible. His regime was characterized by systematic fear, public executions, and a sickly obsession with securing legitimate heirs. The death of his previous wives had plunged him into a paranoia that permeated every decision, every glance, every breath inside the Kremlin. In that suffocating environment, Marfa was crowned not only as consort, but as the last ray of hope for the dynasty. But maternal love and primitive medicine conspired against that imperial destiny. The young woman walked to the altar with death already circulating through her veins, invisible to all present. Her eyes shone with a mixture of emotion and weakness. Her lips could barely pronounce the vows, and her pale skin blended with the ceremonial white of her dresses. The guests, dazzled by the richness of the ceremony, were unaware that inside the Tsarina germinated a poison that would slowly consume her. This is a story that invites us to reflect on the limits of love and the danger of ignorance. Can a mother with the best of intentions condemn her daughter to an inevitable death? What happens when the remedies of an era become lethal weapons? And above all, how can a personal mistake trigger a chain of violence that would forever mark the course of a nation? Prepare to discover how 15 days were enough to change the course of Russia, unleash one of the cruelest revenges ever seen, and feed the dark legend of Ivan the Terrible. What happened in that bridal chamber was not only the death of a Tsarina, but the birth of a monster whose name would remain forever engraved in the history of the world. The year was 1571, and the vast Russian Empire found itself under the weight of the Oprichnina, the reign of terror established by Ivan IV. The capital lived steeped in tension, nobles were watched and brutally punished, and the figure of the Tsar loomed increasingly feared and unpredictable. After the mysterious death of his second wife, Maria Temryukovna, Ivan became obsessed with the need to find a new consort who could give him legitimate offspring. The continuity of the dynasty had become a matter of life and death, not only for the Tsar himself, but also for the political stability of Russia. It was then that he organized what history remembers as the largest matrimonial contest ever seen in Muscovite lands. More than 2,000 young women from all over the empire were summoned to Alexandrovskaya Sloboda, the Tsar's personal fortress located 100 kilometers from Moscow. That fortress, which served both as an imperial residence and as the headquarters of his personal guard, was stained by the blood of public executions and nevertheless became for a few months the stage for a parade of beauty, virtue, and hope. The selection process was not a simple beauty pageant. The candidates had to pass rigorous medical examinations by the imperial physicians, who verified virginity, fertility, and physical endurance. The court astrologers analyzed the stars in search of compatibilities with the Tsar's destiny. Everything was imbued with a solemn and ceremonial air inherited from Byzantine protocols, where the monarch's marriage was as much a private act as a political event of continental dimensions. Out of the initial 2,000 applicants, only 24 were selected in the first screening. Subsequently, this number was reduced to 12 finalists, among whom was a young woman who would soon capture everyone's attention, Marfa Sobakina. Her beauty was described by chroniclers as divine and devastating, with golden hair that seemed to reflect the sunlight and blue eyes compared to the northern lakes. Beyond her appearance, her physical strength and the serenity of her character impressed, qualities that convinced the imperial doctors that she was the ideal candidate to bear healthy heirs. Marfa's origin was not aristocratic, which made her an even more intriguing figure. The daughter of a wealthy merchant from Novgorod, she represented that emerging mercantile class that was beginning to challenge the traditional power of the boyars. Her family, moreover, was related to Malyuta Skuratov, head of the dreaded Oprichnina, a distant link but strong enough to facilitate her advancement in the decisive stages of the selection. Marfa was not simply a beautiful young woman, but a symbol of the future of a Russia torn between aristocratic lineage and economic merit. Before her stood the colossal figure of Ivan the Terrible. At 41 years old, the Tsar was marked by the loss of wives and children under suspicious circumstances, which fueled conspiracy theories and perpetual distrust toward those around him. His imposing physique, almost 2 meters tall, contrasted with the fragility of his mind, oscillating between religious devotion and outbursts of uncontrollable violence. In his obsession with dynastic succession, Ivan saw in Marfa not only a wife, but the last hope of consolidating the absolute power of the dynasty. The final choice took place on June 26, 1571. Marfa was declared the winner of the matrimonial contest and, with it, the new Tsarina of Russia. The news traveled quickly across Europe. Venetian diplomats, German ambassadors, and foreign observers sent alarm reports about the Tsar's movements. Their encrypted letters recounted Ivan's growing mental instability, his sudden fits of rage, and his obsession with finding a companion capable of sustaining his legacy. The union with Marfa was seen as an event not only of familial, but also of enormous geopolitical relevance. However, ominous signs began to appear shortly after the election. Marfa, who until then had appeared strong and healthy, began to suffer from inexplicable weakness, occasional fainting spells, and a fatigue that her ladies-in-waiting could not understand. No one suspected that those first shadows were the announcement of an imminent catastrophe. The court doctors, unable to identify the cause, attributed it to nerves typical of wedding preparations. However, the truth was much darker and was already circulating silently in her body, setting the stage for an unprecedented tragedy. Marfa's story thus advanced toward a point of no return. The young Tsarina was destined to face not only the pressure of being the consort of Russia's most feared monarch, but also the fatal legacy of a potion administered in secret by her mother. What began as a contest intended to ensure the continuity of the empire would end up being the prelude to a drama that would transform Russian history forever. The preparations for the wedding between Ivan IV and Marfa Sobakina were conceived as an unprecedented display of power and wealth. Alexandrovskaya Sloboda, the Tsar's fortress, was dressed up with Persian rugs, Byzantine tapestries, and gold tableware. Everything was arranged so that the ceremony on October 28, 1571, would remain in memory as a splendid event, a symbol of dynastic continuity and Russian greatness. However, behind the luxury and solemnity hid a lethal truth. The bride carried within her the poison that would end her life. The Trinity Church, where the rite was celebrated, was packed with nobles, priests, and foreign ambassadors. Marfa entered supported by her ladies-in-waiting. Her pale skin contrasted with the vibrant red of the ceremonial outfits, and her faltering steps sparked murmurs. During the ceremony, she fainted twice consecutively. The priests interpreted it as a sign of celestial purity, but the doctors present recognized something more sinister. Uncontrollable tremors, cold sweat, dilated pupils, symptoms of severe intoxication, although no one could determine its origin. The wedding banquet, prepared to last until dawn, barely lasted a few hours. The guests withdrew in bewilderment, while the Tsarina was taken to the imperial chambers. Those rooms, adorned with golden braziers that kept the environment warm and scented with oriental incense, were designed for the consummation of a marriage that was supposed to bring heirs to the throne. But what should have awakened passions only served to mask the unmistakable scent of death. On the marital bed, Marfa could barely remain conscious. Her breathing was irregular, her muscles twitched with painful spasms, and a cold sweat soaked the silk sheets. Ivan, dressed in Byzantine tunics, expected to meet a vigorous wife, and instead found a dying woman. His bewilderment mixed with fury, Although at that moment he did not understand that his wife had already been condemned even before pronouncing her vows. The poison circulated with murderous precision throughout Marfa's body, simultaneously attacking the nervous, digestive, and reproductive systems. The mercury, administered in secret by her mother in the form of a fertility potion, was fulfilling its devastating effect. What in the 16th century was considered a miraculous substance, capable of curing syphilis and favoring conception, was now revealed as the most silent and relentless weapon inside the imperial chambers. Every passing hour turned the bridal chamber into a scene of agony. The court doctors tried all kinds of rudimentary remedies, herbal infusions, bloodletting, prayers, and blessed amulets. Nothing could stop the invisible advance of the poison. What should have been the cradle of new dynasties was transformed into a space where maternal love and medical ignorance had woven an irreparable tragedy. That night even understood that something deeper was at stake. Marfa's fragility was no coincidence, nor simple nervousness. As he watched her fight against the pain, a paranoid certainty began to brew in his mind. His wedding had been sabotaged, and behind that supposed betrayal hid a plot against the throne. Unbeknownst to him, his wife's slow agony also sowed the seeds of a wave of revenge that would stain the streets of Moscow with blood. The ceremony that was to be remembered as the celebration of an empire was marked as the omen of a catastrophe. The guests returned to their homes with an unsettling murmur. The priest prayed for the health of the young Tsarina, and the Tsar himself began to lose his patience and sanity. Marfa Sobakina's wedding was not the beginning of a glorious lineage, but the first act of a tragedy that 15 days later would claim the Tsarina's life and drag Russia into an even crueler reign of terror. On November 13, 1571, barely 15 days after the wedding, destiny was fulfilled. Marfa Sobakina died in the Tsar's arms at barely 19 years old, and what could have been the beginning of a new dynastic era became the trigger for a storm of blood and terror. Even Afor, unable to accept the possibility of a medical error or an accident, immediately convinced himself that the death of his third wife was the result of a conspiracy. In his mind, the boyars, the nobles, and even members of the court itself were hatching a plan to weaken his power through poisoning. The Tsar's reaction was as swift as it was brutal. He ordered the capture of more than 20 people, including servants, doctors, and distant relatives of Marfa. No one was safe from the sovereign's suspicions. Mikhail Temryuk, brother of Ivan's second wife, was accused of heading the conspiracy and condemned to the most atrocious execution. Public impalement in Moscow's Red Square. Before thousands of horrified spectators, the ordeal lasted for 3 endless hours, while the other chained prisoners watched with the certainty that they would suffer the same fate. Marfa's father, Vasily Sobakin, managed to escape direct execution, but the punishment he received was no less cruel. He was forced to enter a remote monastery, torn from his life and his family, while his sons were beheaded under the accusation of witchcraft. The desperation of a mother who had tried to help her daughter with a potion thus became the misfortune of the entire family. Ivan's paranoia spread like wildfire. Convinced that the doctors had been accomplices or negligent, he ordered several of them to be tortured to extract confessions. Under torment, some revealed what had until then remained a secret. Marfa's mother had administered to her daughter a mixture of herbs and minerals with mercury, convinced that that remedy would make her fertile and robust to give heirs to the Tsar. The revelation came too late. The innocent had already paid with their lives, and the Russian court had witnessed a senseless butchery. The Tsar's fury was not limited to his inner circle. The terror expanded to all of Moscow. Public executions became even more frequent. The nobles lived in a state of constant fear, and the people watched helplessly as the regime hardened. Ivan, consumed by the idea of invisible betrayals, transformed his personal pain into a political instrument of repression. Every suspicion became a death sentence. Every ambiguous gesture proof of a conspiracy. Centuries later, in 2009, a team of specialists led by forensic scientist S.A. Nikitin conducted a modern analysis of Marfa's remains. The results confirmed mercury poisoning, validating the historical theories that spoke of the potion administered by her mother. The scientific examination yielded a chilling conclusion. There had been no conspiracy by the boyars, no secret plot against the Tsar. The tragedy had been the product of maternal love and the medical ignorance of the time. History, however, was already written in blood. Ivan the Terrible, marked forever by the loss of Marfa, sank even deeper into paranoia and despotism. That bridal chamber, instead of harboring the hope of an heir, had given rise to a more feared monster, capable of turning love into suspicion and tragedy into a pretext to intensify imperial terror. What died with Marfa was not only a young Tsarina, but also the last spark of humanity left in the heart of a Tsar, destined to be remembered for his boundless cruelty. The death of Marfa Sobakina was not limited to being a personal tragedy or an isolated episode in the life of Ivan the Terrible. Its outcome marked a turning point in Russian history and became the fuel for an even more ruthless regime. The Tsar's distrust toward everything and everyone reached an unbearable level. Every glance, every word, even the silence of his subjects was interpreted as a possible sign of treason. The paranoia that brewed in that bridal chamber grew to become a state policy. Historians agree that Marfa's death intensified the climate of terror that already dominated Russia. Ivan, who had previously used the Oprichnina as an instrument of control, now transformed it into a machinery of systematic repression. What began as an intimate drama ended up impacting millions of lives. Every public execution, every forced exile, every torture carried with it the shadow of that poisoned wedding. The maternal love that had sealed Marfa's fate ended up multiplying into an ocean of collective pain. The tragedy also left its mark on Russian art and culture. At the end of the 19th century, the composer Rimsky-Korsakov immortalized this story in the opera The Tsar's Bride, where the figure of Marfa appears as a symbol of innocence, sacrificed by ignorance and ambition. The playwright Lev May was also inspired by that event to write one of his most intense works, transforming the misfortune into a mirror of human passions pushed to the limit. In this way, Marfa's death transcended the limits of history to become a cultural myth. But the echo of this episode is not limited to the artistic realm. It also forces us to reflect on the primitive medicine of the time. Substances like mercury, today recognized as highly toxic, were then considered miraculous remedies. They were used to treat venereal diseases, fertility problems, and even everyday ailments. The lack of scientific knowledge turned what was supposed to cure into a silent weapon that claimed countless lives. Marfa's case was not unique. It represents only the tip of an iceberg of undocumented tragedies. And here an inevitable question arises. How many queens, princesses, and nobles might have suffered similar fates without history daring to record it? How many mothers, moved by love and desperation, might have condemned their daughters to a slow death by trusting in potions passed down by tradition? Marfa's story is the revelation of a secret that remained buried for more than 4 centuries, but it is also the window to a series of enigmas still hidden in the archives of time. The cultural and historical echo of this event lies not only in the executions it triggered or in the artistic works it inspired, but also in the warning it leaves us. Love, when combined with ignorance and fear, can become a devastating weapon. The Tsarina who died in 15 days became a symbol of the fatal consequences of primitive medicine and of how an intimate gesture can change the course of an entire nation. The story of Marfa Sobakina leaves us facing a disturbing dilemma. How could something as pure as a mother's love turn into a daughter's death sentence, and at the same time, the trigger for a wave of terror that changed the course of an empire? What began with a potion intended to guarantee fertility ended up becoming the poison that extinguished an innocent life, dragging all of Russia into an era of suspicion, violence, and paranoia. The figure of Marfa, barely a 19-year-old girl, remains a reminder of the price sometimes paid for ignorance and desperation. Her fate was not only that of a woman trapped in the gears of imperial power, but also that of a victim of a world where superstition was confused with science and where the life of a Tsarina could hang on a seemingly harmless gesture. Every tear shed on her deathbed echoed for centuries in the executions, the exiles, and the fear that gripped Russia under Ivan the Terrible. Today, as we remember this episode, we are not just talking about a personal tragedy or a historical curiosity. We are talking about a universal warning. Power, love, and ignorance can together form a cocktail capable of destroying lives and altering the destiny of entire nations. Marfa became a symbol of that truth. Her brief reign, consumed in just 15 days, was enough to show how history does not always advance through great battles, but also through intimate tragedies that change the course of nations. And now I want to invite you to reflect with me. What struck you the most about this story? The innocence of a mother who wanted to help and ended up destroying her daughter? The brutal revenge of a czar incapable of accepting the truth? Or the revelation that primitive medicine could be as lethal as wars themselves? Leave your comments below and tell me which of these aspects shocked you the most. If this story moved you and you want to discover more secrets hidden in royal bedchambers, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. That way you won't miss our upcoming investigations, where we will reveal even more disturbing mysteries that remain buried for centuries. Because what happened to Marfa Sabakina was just the beginning. Behind her hide many other queens and princesses who suffered equally tragic fates, waiting to be remembered. Share this video with those who are also passionate about secret history, about those tales that show us how the intimate and the political intertwine in an inseparable web of tragedy and power. Let's remember together that history is not only written on battlefields, but also in the tears of those who were silent victims of a ruthless world. The story of Marfa Sabakina, the Tsarina who lived for only 15 days after her wedding, is much more than a tragic tale from 16th century Russia. It is a mirror that reflects the eternal contradictions of human beings: love that turns into poison, hope that transforms into tragedy, and power that feeds on fear until it devours its own subjects. What happened in that bridal chamber was not solely the death of a young woman, but the birth of a cycle of terror that would forever mark an empire. Marfa left no descendants, nor did she exercise power, but her brief passage through history changed the course of Russia. Her death was the spark that ignited Ivan the Terrible's paranoia, a fire that wiped out nobles, doctors, servants, and entire families. And yet she also left a silent legacy, the memory of how the most intimate gestures can alter the destiny of millions. That potion, prepared with love, but loaded with ignorance, not only ended a life, but unleashed a chain of events that echoed in every corner of the empire. Today, more than 4 centuries later, we are still talking about Marfa. Her name appears in operas, dramas, forensic studies, and historical accounts. She has become a symbol of innocence and a warning, a reminder that ignorance can be just as lethal as deliberate malice. And perhaps the most chilling thing is to think about how many other similar stories remain hidden, buried in dusty archives or silenced by time, waiting to be revealed. Let's imagine for a moment the anguish of that mother upon discovering that she had poisoned her own daughter. Let's imagine the desolation of a people subjected to the terror of a monarch, convinced that everything was a conspiracy. Let's imagine how history could have been different if science, knowledge, and prudence had prevailed over superstition. Marfa's tragedy is, ultimately, a lesson that transcends centuries. What we ignore can destroy us, and what we believe to be a remedy can be the cause of our downfall. Dear viewers, this is not just a story from the past. It is an invitation to stay vigilant, not to confuse tradition with truth, and to understand that even the most well-intentioned acts can bring devastating consequences. Remembering Marfa is, in a way, paying tribute to all those invisible victims of history whose names were lost, but whose lives were marked by the same dilemma between love, ignorance, and power. And so we conclude this journey through one of the darkest secrets of Russian royalty. If this story impacted you, share it, comment on which part moved you the most, and join us in our upcoming investigations. Because what you have heard today is just the surface. The world of palaces still holds buried secrets waiting to come to light, and we will be here to reveal them together.